In 2010, deep into the Atacama Desert in Chile, an unstable and dangerous mine under a mountain collapsed. This cave entrapped a group of 33 miners 2,300 feet underground, leaving them with absolutely zero means of escape. The area was destroyed so badly that any rescue effort through the cave would be nearly impossible and incredibly dangerous. This rescue was going to take a long time. Getting these men out of this cave seemed impossible. They were buried by a mountain. Right away, however, the men quickly thought of one solution to escape the mine, a solution that was created just in case something like this would happen. The idea was to escape from the safety ventilation shafts. These shafts were acquired by safety code to have ladders on them for multiple reasons in case of emergency. However, to the men's horror, when they arrived to the shafts, the ladders were missing. This was a problem, a big problem. The safety precautions that should have been in place for emergencies were overlooked and not put in place. The ladders to escape this nightmare easily were not there. Now, with no hope of escape and being surrounded by potentially dangerous rockfall, the shift supervisor of the group, Luis Urzua, was forced to gather the men in a refuge, a safe and secure sealed room where the men would stay where they have shelter, water, and breathable air. The idea was for the men to stay here for some time until rescue came. But what they didn't know was that any form of contact with the outside world would not happen for a very long time after this. Rescuers arrived on scene to quickly try and save these men. With the uncertainty of how dangerous this mine is, on top of not knowing the condition of the 33 men below, those that trekked into the mine did so out of pure risk and consideration for the lives of the men below. Even being in this mine at all was a risk to your life. They ventured into the mine quickly, however, their efforts would be halted when they were met with a massive slab of rock that blocked their path. The main entrance to the mine was out of the question. To them, however, there had to have been at least one way to get to these men. This mine was full of hundreds of corridors that spiraled down for thousands of feet, and each corridor was linked by vertical ventilation shafts that went straight down into the mine. With all of this, there had to have been at least one route. Their hope was lifted due to the idea of descending down these ventilation shafts. Ladders or not, they could descend down and at least contact the men to see if they are even alive. So, the rescue team attempted to descend down the ventilation shafts, with the knowledge that at any time, this mine could rumble and crush all of them. After hours upon hours of searching for routes in the shafts, the main rescue team found a shaft that led below the original collapse. This was huge. This was the shaft that would take them to potentially seeing the 33 men. So they brought even more people in to help, and things were finally looking up. However, in the true fashion of disaster, this mine would not let these men be rescued so easily. Because on August 7th, after hours upon hours of rescue attempts, a second rumble began deep into the mine's corridors. A second collapse had taken place. This was the nail in the coffin. The ventilation shafts and routes were destroyed. At this point, there was no feasible way down. No way that wasn't already incredibly dangerous or just completely blocked off. On top of this, there was no way to ensure that another collapse would take place. It was far too dangerous to continue. These 33 men were literally buried alive. And unfortunately for them, they were buried under the geological components of a mountain and deep rock underground. Digging them out seemed impossible. They were nailed into the Earth's crust. Fortunately, however, the men still had the emergency shelter. It was a decently sized refuge of about 50 square meters. It had 2 long benches that extended across the area, and even better, they had access to the tunnels that weren't affected by the initial collapses. They had access to roughly 2 kilometers of open tunnel to move around in if needed. At the very least, the men were safe for now. But the one problem that these men still faced was food. The emergency shelter only stocked up on about roughly 3 to 4 days worth of edible food. But with the situation quickly turning from a potential few-day rescue to now a multiple-week rescue, these men were going to have to figure out how to ration this food very, very carefully. Even then, though, the food was only going to last so long. There was no telling how long it was going to take to even find these men, let alone complete a full rescue. At this point, things were looking pretty grim. Luis, the shift supervisor, quickly realized the gravity of the situation. He knew the mine very well, and also knew how difficult this rescue would end up being. The situation, to put simply, was very, very complicated. Regardless, Luis calmly took a leadership role and gathered the men and began to organize things throughout the group. He wanted everyone to work together in an organized system. They needed to work together if they wanted to survive this. All of the men took on specific roles. Some organized workers to repair mine damages, some organized prayer to keep the men's spirits high, and some played pranks that they were dying way too early to make the others laugh, saying things like, "Tell my friends and family that I love them," and that all of the money is in the then fake dying. And some acted as medics to watch over the physical and mental state of each other. Prolonged exposure to lack of sunlight and stress like this could easily lead to issues like mental psychosis and disease. These men were under more stress than they could ever imagine. Some had babies on the way, and all had families that needed them at home. All of these men were under a ridiculous amount of stress, so it was very important that they maintained a sense of society and community down there. Keeping things lighthearted and laughing together and watching out for each other was crucial. At this point, it had been more than a few days down in this dark, dusty mine, 2,300 feet under the earth. And keep in mind, they still didn't have a clue on how long it was going to take to get rescued. In the midst of such a life-threatening situation, the stress they must have been feeling is incomprehensible. But what they did to come together and help each other manage stress and build a sense of community and fellowship is nothing short of absolutely beautiful. At the top, however, things were not looking nearly as straightforward. They still had no idea if these men were even alive. To the rescuers, these men could have been crushed in the initial collapse. And to make things even more stressful, a majority of the men's families had all arrived on scene to wait for their rescue. And at this point, they had waited for days. Alongside this, the situation had become national and even international news. The whole world seemed to be watching alongside the rescue team to wait and see for any type of response from the men. Many people rooted online for the men's survival and gave them support. The Chilean president even showed up to support the rescue efforts. But all of this to not a single sign of the men's survival. So at this point, the only thing the rescuers could do is to look at a map of the mine and make an educated guess on where the best area to drill down into would be. They ended up bringing 9 high-speed drilling rigs into the area. And for the next few days, multiple boreholes about 16 centimeters in diameter would be drilled down in specific areas to try and locate the whereabouts of the men. But the drill rig supervisors were conflicted. They knew they had to drill fast because of the oxygen limits and the food limits that the men would face deep into the mine. But unlike what most people would think, drilling isn't nearly as simple as just going straight down into the area you want to. It is much more complicated than that. Due to the nature of the underground rock, certain heavy and disruptive rock formations underground would redirect the drills, literally sending them hundreds of feet off of course. The drilling team literally had to calculate the curvature of the drills and redirect them back on course into the perfect cave corridor. Doing this is, quote, like hitting a perfect football shot into the right-hand corner of the net from half a mile away. And they had to do this fast. To them, these men would perish in days, and it had already been close to a week. And on top of all of this, they were originally given an outdated version of the mine's map, complicating things to a different level. But regardless, the drilling team was doing an incredible job, given what they had to work with. The first drill opens up 1,000 feet down into the mine, to not a single sign of life. Days at this point have passed. The second drill is 1,600 feet down, also no sign of life. More days have passed. At this point, there really was only one other option for drilling into the refuge that existed 2,300 feet down into the mine. They figured if anywhere at all, they would be there, but it was going to take them roughly another week to get there. Yet another week of drilling into the unknown. But regardless, they still go for it and begin drilling again. It takes a while due to it being so incredibly deep down and being in such a precise spot, so they have to be very, very careful. However, they continue to work diligently, and after multiple days, the drill begins to near the refuge. As it approaches the exact spot where the men are, everyone waits in anticipation. This would be the exact moment where they need to get rescued. As it closes in on the refuge, the drill bit that could change the course of these 33 men's lives forever miraculously misses by only less than 100 feet. At this point, most people, including family members, fear that they are all dead. It has been a very long time since the collapse at this point, almost 2.5 weeks. The chances that these men, in these conditions, after this much time, were still kicking seemed incredibly low. The hope that existed above ground seemed gone. These poor people were, to say the least, devastated. At the bottom, however, the men needed them. Unbeknownst to the rescuers, the men could actually hear the drills in the distance getting closer each time. They knew they were being saved, so to them, that's all they had. They needed just one drill to make it there so they can connect with their families again. You see, they had prepared notes to write and put on the drill in case it reaches them. A note that would assure everyone that they were fine. They need just one more drill attempt. At this point, the men were well running out of food. They didn't have much time left. At the top, I don't think anyone expected the rescuers to give up. They certainly wouldn't just leave these men down there. But to them, things looked very bad. It's hard to estimate how long something like this would take. When there's so much uncertainty in each attempt to rescue them, you can only expect the worst. But in the realm of expectations, I don't think anybody expected this to happen. The engineers heard something. They were convinced that they heard a faint banging noise reverberating up the drill. This seemed far-fetched, but it turns out the drill had actually broken into a tunnel somewhat near the refuge. This stopped every single person there right in the tracks. And as they relayed the drill back up the hole, they waited there for 6 hours to see what could have been signs of the 33 miners. Everyone waited patiently. This was the last hope. After being hopeless for days and crying for more, the families had just one more chance to connect with each other. And after 6 hours passed, the drill bit slowly came out of the ground, and the team rushed to it immediately. And what showed on the end of the drill bit that was just traveled to the Earth's crust and back was a note strapped to the tip of the bit. The note read, "We are well in the refuge, all 33 of us." They were alive. They had found the men. After 3 weeks of struggle, despair, and hopelessness, a miracle had shone through the ground and saved their lives. However, I would be lying if I said this rescue was finally over, because the harsh reality of it all is that this is not even half of the problem here. Just being found was only the beginning of their struggles. There was still a massive issue. How in the world were they going to get the men out of there? It had already taken almost 3 weeks to drill one tiny 13-centimeter wide hole down there. If they wanted to drill a hole wide enough to transport a human being, there was no telling how long that would take. It was originally estimated to potentially take take up to 3 months to drill such a hole or even longer. By then, they would have reached Christmas time. At the very least, these tiny little boreholes could at least act as a tunnel to transport important needed items and supplies to the miners. At the very least, they were safe for now. But they needed to do this drilling very, very carefully, because any mishaps in the process could lead to months upon months of delays. So subsequently, the Chilean government developed a comprehensive rescue plan that would hopefully get these men out earlier than not. This plan was based on 3 potential mining operations: a Plan A drill, a Plan B drill, and a Plan C drill. The Plan A drill was comprised of an Australian raise borer called the Strata 950. It was provided generously by the Murray and Roberts Company and weighed a whopping 31 tons, one of the largest mining drills in the entire world. It was so large, in fact, that it had to be shipped in multiple pieces on a massive truck convoy. This drill, in the nature of it being Plan A, began drilling first. The Plan B drill was a T-130XD Air Corps drill that was chosen to actually widen one of the existing boreholes that was keeping the miners supplied with palomas. This drill consisted of multiple teams of specialized personnel and specialized drilling hammers. Firstly, the drill needed to enlarge the 15cm hole to a 30cm hole, then enlarge that again to a 70cm hole. But it had to be done in stages, because the rock would put the drill under way too much pressure. This drill started after Plan A and began on September 5th to dig towards the men's workshop. And finally, the Plan C drill was the most promising one. It was a Canadian Rig 421, an oil drill that could theoretically drill a wide enough hole all the way down without having to widen any existing boreholes. This drill needed a whopping 40 truckloads to be transported into the area. This drill is also technically faster than mining drills, but it would be very difficult to aim such a large oil drill at such a small target. Many people, including the families, had very high hopes for this rig in particular. This rig began drilling on September 19th, and thus, the race between Plan A, B, and C began. As the drills did their thing, it's important to note that waiting was a crucial point here. As horrible as it sounds, these men were forced to wait for any developments in the rescue for weeks. And although I'm sure their hopes and spirits were lifted dramatically after being found and talking to their families, being down there was still incredibly rough and mentally exhausting. On top of the compounded stress they likely felt whilst being rescued, they also had problems eating more food after rationing for so long. An issue called refeeder syndrome, and it actually could be seriously fatal if not handled correctly. The body just doesn't know how to handle a lot of food after learning how to live off of nothing for so long. So, due to this, the Chilean government actually consulted NASA for advice. They worked together to develop a good nutrition plan that would keep these men stable as they re-ate normal amounts of food. These men were trying to adjust, but as constant problems would arise with the drills and their mental health, they would seriously deteriorate significantly. There were a few problems with each drill method. Plan A had multiple technical difficulties, and it was slower due to the hard rock against the type of drill they were using. These delays would significantly hinder the mental and physical strength of the men below. Plan A was essentially out of the question. On top of this, Plan B initially had high hopes and was very fast and effective against the hard rock, but the drill actually could not be steered. They needed to use boreholes as a guide for drilling. This seemed uncertain to say the least. And eventually, later down, the drill bit for Plan B actually broke multiple times and fell into the hole blocking off the path, essentially halting the entire drilling process entirely. The first time it broke, the miners knew nothing of it, and they retrieved the bit out of the hole. But the second time it broke, the bit fell into the hole, and the miners saw what happened. And while they laughed it off, I'm sure they didn't feel too good about it. Every single time there was an issue, the miners could hear the mining stop, and it was hard to explain that there was mechanical issues that could lead to weeks of delays to them. Eventually, Plan C had arrived weeks later, and while it was still likely to be the most effective, it would take 9 days to construct. Regardless, it was still the fan favorite. At this point, the men had been down in this mine longer than anybody in history, and while these men should have been developing a severe array of psychological issues, their resilience and toughness was something that even psychologists above were surprised to see. These men were holding on due to only one thing, and that was their faith. Faith in pretty much everything above ground, and their families. faith that everything would work out, and faith in themselves and their brothers. Luckily and finally, however, a breakthrough occurred. Plan B had broken through underground and completed its first step of widening the boreholes. It was now 12 inches wide, but for it to hold the miners, it would need to be widened another 14 inches. So while they had made it down, they still had a long way to go. But this seemed to lift the motivation of the men, who chanted Chile and held on to each other. However, the drill was still estimated to take upwards of 26 more days to be completed. It had already been 44 days, and to hear that it would take 26 more had to have been ridiculously hard to hear. These men were still under so much tension and psychological distress that they had to be monitored carefully, because at this point, still not even knowing if something were to go wrong, had to have been eating at them. Plan C, however, had finally been completed, and it was estimated to drill its own big enough holes in only 20 days. Plan C seemed to be drilling significantly faster. On top of this, the escape capsule to transport the men out of the ground had arrived. It was just wide enough to fit a human being, and the plan was that they would be dragged out of the ground 2,300 feet in this tiny little capsule for a whopping 20 minutes alone each time. This was a scary thought. Being in such an enclosed space by yourself, getting dragged up by a cord through the ground for 20 minutes had to have been a stressful thing to accept. There was no telling if there would be mechanical issues in the capsule, and especially after being comfortable in your own little cave space. But I'm sure they were also incredibly eager to get out at this point. However, in a sick turn of events, Plan C seemed to be suffering the same fate as Plan A, when its original high hopes of drilling fast was halted by severely hard rock and mechanical issues. It ended up drilling significantly slower than what they thought. It was only drilling 50 feet per day. Plan C was now out of the question. They now relied on only one more drill to save the 33 men. This was their last hope. Plan B drilled pretty fast. It was a massive drill bit with 4 hammers on each side. It was to say the least effective. But the drill, as it did its thing, produced 20 tons of debris that fell down into the mine constantly. This meant that the men below had to clear this debris out constantly, so they had a clear path to them. They worked all day doing this physical labor on top of all the stress and clearing out this mine. The work they put themselves through and the stress that they handled is just incredible. These men had done their dues and completed their work and dealt with their stress. At this point, they deserved rescue. At this point, it had been 60 days, and Plan B was nearing its conclusion, and the miners had worked diligently to clear out the falling debris. But there was just still one last problem here. Plan B was within a 30-foot range of breaking through underground. But just like the beginning when the men were first trapped, the rock was no more stable than it was months ago. The closer that they got to the mine, the more risk they ran that another collapse could happen. As the drill neared the entrance, the risk that the roof would cave in climbed higher and higher. They slowed down the drill and slowly inched it down, as careful as they possibly could. This was the defining moment. This one breakthrough spelled months upon months of rescue, hope, and freedom into reality. This would connect them to the top, connect them to survival, connect them to the faith that they had been diligently and bravely holding on to as hard and enduring as they could for months. And finally, in the morning at 8 a.m., 65 days into the rescue efforts of the 33 men in the mine below, Plan B, the drill provided to widen one of the existing boreholes, broke through and miraculously did so without any complications. And as they set up the final escape capsule on day 69, unsure on how the men would react to such a long, scary, and uncertain trek up the 2,300-foot hole, they were worried for the final escape. But at the very least, they did know one thing that they could rely on when it came to these brave men. And that was their courage. Courage that they needed to endure what they had to survive. The men, still obviously afraid, took on the final challenge that would allow them to leave this nightmare for the last time. And one by one, entered into the escape capsule to leave the mine. One by one, they trekked up the hole. One by one, they were met with their families and their rescuers, and shared that one special moment they had been waiting for. Some chanted in pure bravery, some cried, most hugged their loved ones, and some handed out rocks as souvenirs from down under. And one by one, they left this nightmare, each receiving their own special standing ovation, each relieved and blessed that they had survived. And finally, as the men went by, the final man would be ready to escape. Luis Urzua, the man credited with saving the lives of the 32 other men below with his leadership, hope, and prosperity. He left as the last miner, making sure that his brothers escaped first. On that night, the whole world who had been watching this carefully united to witness the end of a story of pure and utter grit and bravery, a story of technological advancement and trial and error. And most importantly, everybody around the world was there to witness a story of hope.